It was just another Monday at St. Vincent's Medical Center, a bustling hospital known for its excellence in patient care. The corridors buzzed with activity as doctors, nurses, and staff hurried from one room to another. Among them was Nurse Tasha Miller, a seasoned RN with years of experience, a calming presence, and a reputation for her kindness and efficiency. Tasha, with her warm brown eyes and braided hair neatly pinned up, had a way of making patients feel at ease the moment she walked into a room. This morning, however, Tasha found herself assigned to assist Dr. Michael Grant, a prominent surgeon notorious for his sharp tongue and inflated ego. Dr. Grant's brilliance in the operating room was unmatched, but his bedside manner left much to be desired. His condescending attitude toward nurses, particularly those he deemed incompetent, often made him a figure of quiet disdain among the staff. Tasha had worked with him a few times before and had managed to avoid his ire, but something about today felt different. The tension started the moment Tasha stepped into room 307. The patient, a man in his late 50s, was sitting upright in bed, his expression unreadable. His piercing gray eyes darted between Tasha and Dr. Grant as if assessing every movement, every word. Despite his unassuming hospital gown, there was an air of authority about him, a quiet confidence that made the room feel smaller. Dr. Grant, clipboard in hand, barely glanced at Tasha before barking, "Miller, check his vitals. And do it quickly, I don't have all day." Tasha nodded, unbothered by his brusque tone. She had long since learned to keep her cool under pressure. As she moved to the patient's side, she offered him a small smile. "Good morning, sir. How are you feeling today?" Before the patient could respond, Dr. Grant interjected, his voice dripping with impatience. "This isn't a social call, Miller. Just do your job." Tasha stiffened but said nothing. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around the patient's arm, her movements steady despite the growing unease in the room. The patient, however, seemed unfazed. In fact, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he watched the exchange. As Tasha noted the readings, Dr. Grant stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "Are you sure you're reading that correctly?" he snapped. "Let me see." Tasha handed in the clipboard without protest. 120/80, she said calmly. "That's within the normal range." Dr. Grant rolled his eyes. "I'll double-check it myself. You nurses always seem to miss the finer details." The patient raised an eyebrow but remained silent. Tasha, meanwhile, bit her lip to keep from responding. It wasn't the first time she had been undermined by a doctor, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, something about Dr. Grant's tone today was particularly cutting. As Dr. Grant busied himself with the clipboard, he began a loud, unsolicited critique of Tasha's skills. "This is exactly why I insist on training sessions for nurses. Half of them wouldn't last a day without a doctor holding their hand. It's embarrassing, really." The patient's faint smile disappeared, replaced by a steely gaze. He shifted slightly in the bed, his posture straightening despite the IV line attached to his arm. Tasha noticed the change but didn't say anything. Instead, she focused on adjusting the patient's pillow, her hands trembling slightly. Dr. Grant didn't stop. "And don't get me started on the hiring standards these days. It seems like anyone with a pulse can put on scrubs and call themselves a professional." "Excuse me," the patient finally said, his voice calm but firm. "That's quite enough." Dr. Grant turned to him, his expression a mix of irritation and surprise. "I beg your pardon." "I said that's enough," the patient repeated. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "You've made your point, doctor. I think Nurse Miller has conducted herself with professionalism and grace, despite your commentary." Dr. Grant blinked, clearly taken aback. "Sir, I didn't mean to." The patient raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save your excuses. You're not the only one in this room who understands the importance of respect. And I assure you, your behavior will be addressed." Tasha's eyes widened, but she quickly schooled her expression. Dr. Grant, meanwhile, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. Who was this patient? And how did he command such authority with just a few words? Tasha glanced at the name on his chart, Mr. Charles Whittaker. The name rang no immediate bells, but there was something about him. Something that hinted at a story far bigger than anyone in that room could imagine. Dr. Grant's expression shifted between indignation and confusion, but he chose not to press the matter further. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and began jotting notes on the clipboard, though his usual air of superiority seemed slightly deflated. Tasha, still reeling from the unexpected turn, remained silent as she focused on organizing the patient's medications on a tray. The tension in the room was palpable, but beneath it all, curiosity gnawed at her. Who exactly was Mr. Whittaker? The patient's calm demeanor never wavered, even as Dr. Grant fumbled with his composure. "Nurse Miller," Mr. Whittaker said suddenly, his voice smooth yet commanding, "would you mind staying for a moment after the doctor leaves? I'd like to ask you a few questions." Tasha hesitated, glancing briefly at Dr. Grant, who was now staring at Mr. Whittaker with a mix of suspicion and irritation. "Of course," she replied, her professional tone masking her inner unease. Dr. Grant snapped his pen cap shut and tucked the clipboard under his arm. "I have other patients to see," he said tersely. "If you have any concerns, Mr. Whittaker, I'll be back later." He didn't wait for a response and strode out of the room, his white coat billowing slightly as he went. The door clicked shut, leaving Tasha and Mr. Whittaker alone. She felt the weight of his gaze as she turned to face him. His grey eyes were sharp, piercing, as if he could see right through her. Yet there was no hostility in his expression, only an unsettling sense of awareness. "Thank you for staying," he said, his voice softer now. "I imagine working with someone like Dr. Grant isn't easy." Tasha managed a small smile. "It's part of the job," she said simply. "Doctors can be demanding." Mr. Whittaker chuckled, a deep, rich sound that momentarily broke the tension. "That's a polite way of putting it. But I'd say you handled yourself with remarkable patience." "Thank you," she said, her cheeks warming slightly. "Is there something you'd like to discuss?" He leaned back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving hers. "Before I answer that, I have a question for you. Do you always let people like and talk to you that way?" Tasha blinked, caught off guard by the directness of his question. "It's not about letting them," she said after a moment. "I've learned to pick my battles. Sometimes it's easier to stay quiet and focus on the patient." "That's admirable," he said, nodding. "But it's also important to stand up for yourself. Respect is a two-way street." Tasha wasn't sure how to respond. She felt both validated and slightly uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. "I do my best," she said finally. "Now, about those questions." Mr. Whittaker smiled faintly, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, of course. But first, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Charles Whittaker, though most people in my professional circle call me Charlie." She tilted her head slightly. The name still didn't ring any bells, but his tone suggested it should. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Whittaker." "Likewise," he replied. "Tell me, Nurse Miller, how long have you been working here?" "About 5 years," she answered. "I started right after finishing my training. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," he said, though his expression suggested there was more to it than that. "And how do you like it here?" "I love my work," she said honestly. "The staff is like family, and I enjoy helping people. It can be challenging, but it's rewarding." He nodded again, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "That's good to hear. People like you are the backbone of places like this. But I imagine it's not always easy when you have people like Dr. Grant treating you the way he did." Her stomach tightened at the mention of Dr. Grant. "Like I said, it's part of the job," she replied cautiously. "Is it?" he asked, his tone pointed but not unkind. "Or is it something you've been taught to accept because you think you don't have a choice?" Tasha's hands fidgeted slightly with the hem of her scrub top. She wasn't used to this kind of conversation, especially with a patient. "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I've never really thought about it like that." Mr. Whittaker studied her for a moment before leaning forward slightly. "Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but I've spent my career studying systems and how they treat the people within them. And from what I've seen today, you deserve better." "Studying systems," she echoed, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Whittaker?" A hint of a smile returned to his face, though this time it carried a trace of mystery. "Let's just say I've made it my life's work to understand power dynamics, how they're built, how they're maintained, and how they can be changed." Tasha's brow furrowed. "Are you some kind of sociologist?" "Something like that," he said, his tone deliberately vague. "Though my work tends to be more hands-on than academic." She wasn't sure what to make of his answer, but before she could press further, he leaned back against the pillows and sighed. "I imagine you have other patients to see. I won't keep you any longer, Nurse Miller, but I'd like to continue this conversation later if you're willing." "Of course," she said, though her mind was already racing with questions. Who was this man, really? And why did he seem so interested in her experiences? As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Charles Whittaker than met the eye. His words lingered in her mind, unsettling yet oddly empowering. What had he meant about systems and power dynamics? And why had he been so quick to defend her against Dr. Grant? Back at the nurse's station, Tasha found herself glancing at the computer screen, tempted to search for more information about her enigmatic patient. But before she could act on the impulse, Dr. Grant stormed past, his face flushed with anger. "Nurse Miller," he barked. "A word now." Tasha's stomach sank as she followed him into an empty office. Whatever this was, she knew it wouldn't be good. Dr. Grant's outburst had made one thing clear. Charles Whittaker wasn't just any patient. He was someone important, someone who had the power to rattle even the most arrogant of doctors. And Tasha was about to find out why. Dr. Grant slammed the office door behind them, his expression a storm of barely contained frustration. Tasha stood near the desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, bracing for whatever was coming next. The small office, cluttered with medical journals and a faint smell of disinfectant, felt even more stifling under the weight of his glare. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" Dr. Grant asked, his voice low but tense. Tasha blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No," she admitted. "Should I?" Dr. Grant scoffed, pacing the narrow space like a caged animal. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You don't pay attention to anything outside your little tasks, do you?" Tasha's jaw tightened, but she bit back a retort. Now wasn't the time to let her frustration show. "If there's something I need to know about Mr. Whittaker, then tell me." Dr. Grant stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mix of anger and unease. Charles Whittaker isn't just some ordinary patient. He's the CEO of Medcore. The name hit Tasha like a slap. Medcore was one of the largest healthcare corporations in the country, known for its expansive network of hospitals, research facilities, and pharmaceutical branches. Their influence was felt everywhere, from the funding of medical schools to the policies shaping patient care. And the man in room 307 was at the top of it all. Tasha's mind raced, replaying her interactions with Mr. Whittaker. His calm authority, his pointed questions about respect and power dynamics. It all made sense now. But why would someone like him be here, in a standard hospital room with no fanfare or entourage? Dr. Grant crossed his arms, his irritation mounting. "Do you understand now? This isn't just some routine patient you can chat with about your feelings. Every word you say to him could have consequences. For you, for me, for this entire hospital." "I didn't know," Tasha said quietly. He didn't exactly introduce himself as the CEO of Medcore. "Well, now you do," Dr. Grant snapped. "And if you're smart, you'll stay out his way. The last thing we need is him finding more reasons to critique how we run things." Tasha frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface despite her best efforts to suppress it. "With all due respect, Dr. Grant, he's not the one critiquing how things are run. You are. And if I recall correctly, he was defending me." Dr. Grant's face darkened, but before he could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. It swung open to reveal Dr. Patel, the hospital's chief of staff. Her expression was neutral, but her presence alone carried enough authority to silence the tension in the room. "Dr. Grant, Nurse Miller," Dr. Patel said, her tone measured. "I need to speak with both of you." The three of them moved to a larger conference room down the hall. As they sat around the polished wooden table, Dr. Patel folded her hands neatly in front of her, her sharp eyes shifting between them. "I've just spoken with Mr. Whittaker," she began. "He had some interesting observations about the care he's received here. Specifically, he mentioned an incident involving the two of you." Tasha felt her stomach tighten, but Dr. Patel's gaze lingered on Dr. Grant. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the confident facade he usually wore beginning to crack. "Care to explain what happened?" Dr. Patel asked, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Dr. Grant cleared his throat, clearly choosing his words carefully. "There was a minor disagreement," he said. "Nothing significant. Mr. Whittaker seemed to misinterpret a perfectly normal exchange between myself and Nurse Miller." "Is that so?" Dr. Patel said, her voice cool. She turned to Tasha. "Nurse Miller, would you like to add anything?" Tasha hesitated, weighing her words carefully. She knew that challenging Dr. Grant in front of Dr. Patel could backfire, but she also felt a responsibility to be honest. "Dr. Grant was critical of my work in front of Mr. Whittaker," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I didn't respond because I didn't want to escalate the situation." Dr. Patel studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you for your honesty, Nurse Miller. For the record, Mr. Whittaker's concerns had less to do with medical competence and more to do with professionalism and respect. He specifically mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the way Dr. Grant addressed you." Dr. Grant's face flushed a deep red. With all due respect, Dr. Patel, Mr. Whittaker doesn't understand the dynamics of hospital workflow. I have high standards, and sometimes that means being direct. There's a difference between being direct and being disrespectful, Dr. Patel said firmly. And if the CEO of Medcore finds your behavior problematic, I suggest you reevaluate your approach. Dr. Grant opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. Dr. Patel shifted her attention back to Tasha. As for you, Nurse Miller, Mr. Whittaker was impressed by your professionalism and compassion. He specifically requested that you remain on his care team. Tasha's eyes widened in surprise. Of course, she said quickly. I'll do my best. I'm sure you will, Dr. Patel said. In the meantime, I suggest both of you tread carefully. Mr. Whittaker's presence here is not something to take lightly. As the meeting ended and they left the conference room, Dr. Grant shot Tasha a withering look before storming off. She let out a slow breath, her mind still reeling from the revelations. Mr. Whittaker's influence was undeniable, but his intentions remained a mystery. What did he want from her, and why was he paying such close attention to the dynamics within the hospital? Back at her station, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Every word, every glance from Mr. Whittaker carried weight, as if he were piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Whatever it was, she had the distinct impression that her role in it wasn't over yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Tasha. Every moment she wasn't actively working with a patient, her thoughts circled back to Mr. Whittaker. His calm yet penetrating gaze, his cryptic words about systems and power, and now the knowledge of his identity. It was all too much. Even as she carried out her usual tasks, she felt the weight of something larger looming just out of reach, like the edge of a storm rolling in. When her shift ended, Tasha found herself lingering in the hallway outside room 307. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, a chance to ask Mr. Whittaker more questions, or maybe just to see if he'd reveal any more pieces of the puzzle. But as the door opened and Dr. Patel stepped out, Tasha froze. Dr. Patel gave her a knowing look. He asked for you, she said simply before walking away. Tasha hesitated, her pulse quickening. The knowledge that Mr. Whittaker had specifically requested her felt both flattering and unnerving. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the monitors. Mr. Whittaker was sitting up in bed, a book resting in his lap. When he saw her, he smiled, but it was a small, reserved expression, as if he knew the weight of the conversation they were about to have. Nurse Miller, he said warmly, thank you for coming. You asked for me, she replied, stepping closer. Is everything all right? He nodded, setting the book aside. Everything's fine, but there's something I need to discuss with you, and it couldn't wait. Tasha's heart pounded as she pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. What's this about? She asked, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. Mr. Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. You've impressed me, Nurse Miller. Your professionalism, your patience, and most importantly, your integrity. You've handled yourself with grace in a situation where many others might have faltered. Thank you, Tasha said, though she couldn't hide the confusion in her tone. But why does that matter to you? Because I see potential, he said simply. Potential not just in you, but in what you represent. This hospital, this system, it's flawed. You've experienced that firsthand. Yet, instead of letting it break you, you found a way to persevere. Tasha frowned, unsure where this was leading. Are you saying you want to fix the system? Exactly, Mr. Whittaker said, his grey eyes sharp and focused. And I need people like you to help me do it. Her breath caught. Help you? How? Before he could answer, there was a sharp knock at the door. It swung open to reveal Dr. Grant, his face flushed and his demeanor barely contained. His eyes flicked between Tasha and Mr. Whittaker, suspicion etched across his features. I need a moment, Dr. Grant said, his voice clipped. Mr. Whittaker raised an eyebrow but didn't object. Tasha stood reluctantly, unsure if she should leave. Mr. Whittaker caught her hesitation and gave her a reassuring nod. It's fine, Nurse Miller. We'll continue this later. As she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was about to happen. She lingered near the door, her ears straining to catch fragments of the conversation inside. You're overstepping, Dr. Grant's voice hissed, low but filled with tension. This is my hospital, my department. I don't need you coming in here and undermining my authority. Your authority? Mr. Whittaker's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. Is that what you call berating your staff in front of patients? Disrespecting the very people who make your job possible? You have no idea how things work here. Dr. Grant snapped. "You think you can waltz in and make judgments after a day in a hospital bed? You're nothing but a corporate suit, woo." "Enough," Mr. Whittaker interrupted, his tone sharp and final. "This conversation is over." Tasha stepped back as the door opened abruptly. Dr. Grant stormed out, his expression a mix of rage and humiliation. He didn't even glance her way as he marched down the hall. Moments later, the door opened again, and Mr. Whittaker appeared, his calm facade unshaken. "Nurse Miller," he said, gesturing for her to return. "I believe we were interrupted." Tasha stepped inside, her pulse racing. "What just happened?" "Nothing that concerns you," he said smoothly. "At least not yet." The cryptic response only heightened her unease. "What do you mean?" Mr. Whittaker smiled faintly. "Let's just say that some people are resistant to change. But that's why we need individuals like you, those who aren't afraid to do what's right, even when it's difficult." Her stomach churned as his words sank in. Whatever Mr. Whittaker was planning, it was clear he intended for her to be a part of it. But the question remained, what exactly was he planning, and how far would he go to see it through? Tasha sat there, trying to process everything. Mr. Whittaker's calm demeanor and cryptic words only added to the growing knot in her chest. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in. Before she could ask more questions, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Tell me, Nurse Miller," he began, his eyes locking onto hers. "Have you ever wondered why hospitals like this struggle to retain good staff? Why people like you are forced to shoulder burdens that should be shared?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She had wondered, of course she had. The endless shifts, the lack of support, the moments where she felt invisible despite giving everything she had. All the time, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not like I can change any of it." Mr. Whittaker's faint smile returned, this time tinged with something darker, something determined. "What if I told you that you could? That we could?" Before she could respond, her pager buzzed loudly, jolting her back to reality. She glanced down and saw an urgent call from the nurse's station. "I have to go," she said, standing quickly. "We'll talk later." Mr. Whittaker nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, we will." The station was a flurry of activity when Tasha arrived. One of her colleagues, Mia, looked up, her face pale. "It's Dr. Grant," she said, her voice shaky. "There's been an incident." Tasha felt her stomach drop. What kind of incident? Mia glanced around, lowering her voice. "He collapsed in his office. They're saying it might be a cardiac event." The words hit Tasha like a brick. Despite the clashes, the thought of Dr. Grant in such a vulnerable state felt unreal. She rushed toward his office, where a team of medics was already working. The air was thick with tension as they wheeled him out on a stretcher, his usually commanding presence reduced to a frail figure under the harsh fluorescent lights. As the medics disappeared down the hall, Tasha found herself standing there numb. She barely registered Mia coming up beside her. "What happened?" Tasha asked, her voice hollow. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting around as though checking for eavesdroppers. "There was some kind of argument earlier," she said softly. "With Mr. Whittaker, I heard shouting." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. "Shouting?" Mia nodded. "I don't know what it was about, but it sounded serious. And now this." The implication hung heavy in the air. Could the argument with Mr. Whittaker have triggered Dr. Grant's collapse? The thought was almost too much to bear, yet it refused to leave her mind. Tasha spent the rest of the evening in a daze, her thoughts circling back to the strange chain of events. Mr. Whittaker's mysterious agenda, Dr. Grant's sudden collapse. It all felt connected, though she couldn't quite piece together how. Later that night, as she was preparing to clock out, she noticed something strange. A man in a sharp suit was standing near the nurse's station, speaking in low tones to Dr. Patel. His presence felt out of place, his demeanor too polished for the controlled chaos of the hospital. Tasha couldn't hear what they were saying, but Dr. Patel's expression was tense, her usual calm slipping. The man glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting Tasha's before he turned back to Dr. Patel. Something about the look sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was the look of someone who had taken note of her, someone who had plans. Tasha lingered, pretending to organize papers as she watched them. After a few moments, Dr. Patel walked away, leaving the man alone. To Tasha's surprise, he headed straight toward room 307. She felt her pulse quicken as he disappeared inside, the door closing firmly behind him. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than her, bigger than anything she had imagined. And now, with Dr. Grant out of the picture and strangers appearing in the middle of the night, the hospital felt like a ticking time bomb. Tasha knew one thing for certain. The answers she needed weren't going to come easily, and the choices she would have to make might change everything.